Hi, this is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at Herbin Larmes de Cassis. I'll do a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll compare Larmes de Cassis to similar inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Larmes de Cassis came off the nib of my glass dip pen nice and uniformly. I like it when I'm able to make an E and the little loop doesn't close up. But I was surprised by the swatches that I made with my tweezers. On all the papers that I tried, the ink was just not able to hold on to the paper, even though there would still be ink between basically the tines. I wasn't able to get a drip at the end of the swatch, but in my little scribble up here, you can almost see a halo of darker ink. It's very subtle, like the shading, there's not much shading, but the ink does not look flat. It doesn't look like I'm writing with a magic marker. There is some character to it. And I didn't see any sheen in any of the swatches or scribbles that I made. I'm going to begin with a writing sample from my Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. I suppose this has something to do with the character of this ink. Like I said, the lines that my glass dip pen made were nice and crisp. So the lines that my extra fine nib makes are also nice and crisp. So they're very fine. And this is just my personal preference. This ink is a little bit light for this fine of a line for me. The legibility is just lacking a little bit. It was nice. I was able to feel that this was a fine nib, but I would classify it as nice. The nib didn't feel scratchy on the page, and I was able to write with a fairly light hand. Next, I'll be writing with a Lamy CP1. It also has an extra fine stainless steel nib. I was worried that this ink might feel dry, but this is nice and smooth, very pleasant on this smooth Tomoe River paper. Next, I'll be writing with a Kaweco AL Sport. This is the golden espresso finish. I've installed my Kaweco 14 karat fine nib for this writing sample. Not quite as wet as the Lamy Extra Fine, but it felt very similar. It was just as smooth. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot E95S. It also has a 14 karat fine nib. I'm very happy with how this pen writes. I normally use KWZ Honey, but this ink just performs so well in this pen, it would give me some variety to use. The KWZ Honey brings out the gold trim, but I feel like this ink is not matchy-matchy, but looks nice with the burgundy part of the pen. And it just feels, again, just very smooth. A lot of my Pilot Gold nibs have dry upstrokes, but this E95S nib tends to write much wetter than most of my Pilot Fine nibs, and it doesn't have those dry upstrokes. But I was surprised to see here that my Kaweco does have the dry upstrokes. Next, I've got a Platinum 3776. It has a 14 karat medium nib. This is a very nice pen and ink pairing just when you look at it on its own, but I think I've been spoiled by these previous three pens. They were much smoother. Platinum has that characteristic feedback. I would call this nice. I wouldn't call it smooth, but it's not unpleasant at all. And it's not even, I wouldn't even make a note that there is feedback here, but it's just nice, but not as smooth as the previous three. Next, I'll be writing with my Pilot Grants. It also has a 14 karat medium nib. Now the Grants is much wetter. It may just look slightly wetter in the smear, but in writing it is much wetter. You can see the line looks much bolder than the Platinum medium. I actually prefer writing in larger rulings with these Pilot medium nibs because they are wetter and it makes it write a bit broader. But it is very smooth. Next, I've got a Fully 017. I've replaced the nib with a Nimacine .6 stub nib. I've still got a bit of experimenting to do with this nib. I have two of these .6 stub nibs, and one writes a bit wetter than the other. This one is the more dry writer, and I just need to do some more long-term testing. This was very smooth, and I like the subtle line variation that I get with this .6 stub nib, but in some writing samples, I just had some trouble with the pen wanting to write a little too dry, and I would have to exert a little more pressure. But on this paper, it's very smooth. And it doesn't have to seem to be having too much trouble grabbing the paper. The F was a little bit wispy, but it looks like once it did start grabbing onto the paper, it was writing okay. Next, I've got a Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. This nib just feels very pleasant, not glassy smooth, just a hint of feedback, probably more audible than actual tactile feedback, but seems very smooth. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stainless steel stub nib. Just a bit uncomfortable. I don't know if you can tell from the lines that it's putting down, but It's almost like it's having trouble maintaining a grip on the paper, kind of like my tweezer swatch did up here. While that dries, let's take a look at some other writing samples. On my Rhodia paper, you can see that I had trouble with the tweezer swatch wanting to hold on to the paper, which kind of surprised me because the ink went down on the paper so crisply and uniformly with the glass dip nib. It just surprises me that it has such trouble with the tweezer swatch. Every nib that I tried was pleasant to write with. Some of them were very smooth, some of them had some feedback, but even the platinum that I had that feedback were pleasant to write with. My favorites were the E95S and the Lamy CP1. I felt like the ink flow was just perfect in those. It wasn't too light, it wasn't too heavy. Even the Kakuno felt nice to write with, though the legibility of it on these 5mm grids, I feel like is just a little bit too light, but it felt pleasant enough, the nib on the paper. Now, on copy paper, I wasn't as fond of this ink. Most of them felt pretty nice to write with. Now, the Grants did feel a little too wet, like I was getting too much ink, and the Kaweco was dry. It was smooth, but it was actually dry. Not as much ink was going down on the paper. But really, all of these, I just didn't like the look of the ink as it was going down. I could tell it looked like it was too wet. The ink, you can see, kind of spread and the letters look ragged. And I've mentioned before, sometimes those ragged letters give your writing some interest and some character. It just really depends on the ink. With this ink, I just think it looks unattractive. But as far as how they felt while writing, they were pleasant enough to use on this type of paper. On Leuchtturm paper, I'm not seeing any sheen and not really seeing any shading, but there's something about this ink, it still has character. Perhaps it's that there's a subtle halo to the letters. To the naked eye, you probably wouldn't notice it, but there's just enough of something like that just to give the ink some character. When you write with this ink on copy paper, it just looks like you've written with a magic marker. But on this Rhodia paper, you can tell there's something different. It's got something interesting about it. Herbin Larmes de Cassis was most similar to Sailor Mano Akebi. They're a very similar color, but Akebi is more saturated. It doesn't get as light. You can see there's more variation in the swatch here. And Akebi, you'll see some sheen in the heavier spots. Now, I kind of put this in it kind of straddles the line between purple and magenta. My favorite purple was Herbin Poussière de Lune, which was similar to Ferris Wheel Press Grape Ice Pop and Diatramentis Aubergine. But I found that the pens that I like to use this ink in, I'm kind of liking this ink as well. They're two very different inks, but I tend to like both of them. I like to use Iroshizuku Yamabudo in that Lamy CP1, but I'm also liking Larmes de Cassis. It's similar. They're both kind of magenta. This has a little more dustiness to it. And then Black Swan and Australian Roses is a bit brighter, and Noodler's Cactus Fruit Eel is much brighter. So I find this is a nice alternative if you don't want something as bright or as vibrant as these magentas. And I went ahead and pulled Sailor Shikiori Yozakura. When you compare the writing sample that I did with the Kaweco AL Sport to the Kaweco AL Sport over here, this has a nice pink look to it. It leans a little bit more toward the magenta, but it's got a nice pink feel, where this Yozakura may be a bit too light for your finer nibs. But if you're wanting something that has a pink feel to it, this might be a good alternative. Herbin Larmes de Cassis has a surprising amount of water resistance. When I put it in the water, I did a writing sample on rhodia paper, and then I submerged it in water for 10 minutes, and you saw a lot of the pink coming up, and what was left behind is a purpley blue component of the ink, and it's a bit hazy around the letters, but still very legible. And this was also surprising. This is how Larmes de Cassis compares to the water resistance test on Poussière de Lune. Larmes de Cassis is a watery kind of translucent ink, but I don't appear to have any of it wanting to come through the paper, even on the heavier swatches. I'm surprised by how much I liked this ink. I think this will kind of fill a void in my collection for a pink. I know it leans pretty heavily toward the magenta, but since I use a lot of fine nibs, I need something that's going to be nice and legible. And I think my favorite is the E95S. I love the character that this ink has. I liked writing with it as well as reading it back. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.